Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Good evening and welcome to the 2022 Mannequin Clark Lecture presented by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. I am Zainab Sayilgan, the Muslim scholar for ICJS, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you to tonight's lecture, American Muslims at a Crossroads with Dalia Mogahed. Welcome to those of you here in person at the Islamic Society of Baltimore and to the hundreds of people tuning in from around the world on YouTube. This annual lecture is named in honor of two late civic leaders, Bernard Mannequin and James Clark, in recognition of their enduring interreligious friendship. With the support of their families, this endowed lecture annually brings leading thinkers to Baltimore whose work advances the building of the interreligious community. I'd like to acknowledge 4 members of the Mannequin family in our auditorium tonight. Would you please stand up so we can acknowledge you? Thank you. Thank you for coming. Before I turn to our featured speaker, I'd like to offer our thanks to our gracious hosts from the Islamic Society of Baltimore and to introduce Imam Yassin Sheikh, who is the lead resident scholar and head of community affairs here at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, who will offer a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Sister Zainab. Assalamu alaikum. And good evening to all of you. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Islamic Society of Baltimore, our leadership. We're honored that you're here. We're honored that ICJS selected and chose ISB as the venue to host this amazing event. We're also honored to have Sister Dalia join us tonight, and I hope you have an informative evening and an evening filled with knowledge and also an extension of love and also compassion and interreligious relationships that are going to be built due to sessions and programs like this. Anybody who wants to visit the mosque in the future, you have an open door invitation. Feel free to reach out, and we'll be honored to host you and your groups as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imam Yassin. Before we proceed, I want to remind you of the location of the emergency exits. If the need arises, you can safely exit the room through the doors that lead directly outside, located to my right, your left, at the back of the room. Now, just a few words about how we will proceed tonight. Following the lecture shortly before 8 p.m., we will take a break so that the Muslims present can gather in the prayer hall to offer their evening prayers. During that time, those remaining in this room will have time for conversation with the neighbor. You will notice that each of you has an index card on your chair. If at any point during the lecture you have a question for Mrs. Mogahed for the Q&A portion, please write it down and we will collect them. At 8:15, we will reconvene for the Q&A with our speaker. We will conclude with some light refreshments at the round tables at the other side of the room so you can continue your conversations. And now let me turn to the topic of tonight's lecture, American Muslims at a Crossroads. As a Muslim born and raised in Germany to Kurdish parents from Turkey, now living in the United States with very American children, I know something about the diversity of American Muslims. I know how difficult it is to categorize us, and I have experienced how misunderstood our community can be. But even I have been surprised with the work of Dalia Mogahed and the findings of the American Muslim poll, which she leads as the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, known as ISPU. Earlier this year, ISPU released the 6th installment of the American Muslim poll, which surveys not only Americans who are Muslim, but Americans of other faith and no faith making it the most comprehensive and respected study of the American Muslim community. Dalia Mogahed was born in Cairo, Egypt, and came to the United States at the age of 4. She is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree in chemical engineering and a minor in Arabic. She has an MBA from the University of Pittsburgh. She previously chaired the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies and was appointed by President Barack Obama as an advisor to the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. She is the co-author of Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, and appeared on a PBS documentary based on the book. And if all that wasn't enough, she's also a YouTube star. Her TED Talk, What's Like to Be a Muslim in America, has received nearly 9 million views. It is an honor to welcome Dalia Mogahed.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. It's such an honor to be here, and I want to first thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule on this rainy Monday night to be here today. I also want to thank the ICJS for choosing me to really this huge honor of being able to give this lecture today. As you heard, I was born in Egypt and grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, where, like any self-respecting Egyptian, I majored in engineering. But I wasn't just doing engineering in college. I also wrote for my college newspaper on issues of Muslim studies, even though I didn't have a name for it at the time. I also headed an organization in college called the Bosnia Relief Committee that provided relief and medical supplies to war-torn Bosnia at the time. So I always had my heart in two places, one in the sciences and one in building bridges and cultural education. And so it is such a pleasure to finally bring these two sides of myself together in the work I do now, where I apply the scientific method and empirical methods of inquiry to highly charged emotional topics around interfaith and interreligious relations. And that's really the journey and the topic that I want to take you through today. At a time where we are at the crossroads, at a time where our country is so often at odds, polarized, in disagreement, not even aligned on the basic facts, it can be very helpful to start out with a foundation of research that we can then discuss, talk about, and make good policy from evidence, not assumptions. And that's really the vision and mission of ISPU. Our mission is to inform dialogue and decisions concerning American Muslims. So you can follow us on our various social media, and you can always feel free to share anything that you find interesting from my talk publicly on these and tag these media as well. So what I'll go through today is why this poll. I'll go very briefly over our methodology, and then I'll dive into key findings, and then we will have Q&A at the end. So why this poll? What was the backdrop of us fielding this poll earlier this year? This is from this year, 2022. We are now living in a new phase of COVID-19. We've been through a pandemic for 2.5 years and wanted to understand how this phenomena has impacted the various religious communities in the United States. Many of us have had economic struggles as a result of the pandemic and the economic whirlwind that it set off. We also have been struggling as a country, the ongoing racial inequity that our country is continuing to reckon with, gun violence, and, of course, a growing partisan divide. So the American Muslim Poll is a nationally representative survey of Muslims, Jews, Protestants within the Protestant community, white evangelicals, Catholics, as well as non-affiliated Americans. Our topics for this poll, and I won't go through all of them, but they are wide-ranging. I encourage you to check out the poll for yourself on our website. But we covered demographics, religious discrimination and Islamophobia, civic engagement, voter suppression, a bunch of hot-button issues, and much, much more. So as for our methodology, very briefly, ISPU commissions an organization called SSRS to field this survey for us. So we create the questionnaire and they field the survey. SSRS is a national leader in research. In fact, we found them by looking up who does polls of American Jews. American Jews are similar to American Muslims in that they're not counted in the census. They're a small percentage of the population. And we found SSRS does all polls of American Jews in the United States. And so we chose them, and they were thrilled to work with us on the American Muslim poll. They also do polling for CNN, CBS, ABC, The Washington Post, and many other news outlets. The sampling and weighting was led by Dr. Jonathan Best, and he's the Vice President for Advanced Scientific Methods at SSRS. So specifically, we have a sample of around 800 Muslims that were included in this poll, 350 Jews, 207 Catholics, 297 Protestants, 200 white evangelicals, and 235 non-affiliated Americans. So the way we do it is we basically oversample Muslims and Jews, and then we get a representative sample of 1,200 of the national public, of the general public, that we then divide into the various denominations. Specifically, the field date, so just keep this in mind, was February 22nd to March 21st of this year. And you can read the entire report at ispu.org/poll. This is our list of advisors, again, names that you might be familiar with, but some of the top experts on polling and Muslim studies in the United States. So what are our key findings? What did we discover when we did this massive study of American opinion? Americans who are Muslims are more likely to be young. So demographically, this is the youngest faith community in the United States. They're also the most likely faith community to be low income. This doesn't mean all Muslims are poor, but they're certainly not all rich. The largest percentage of people who report low income are actually in the Muslim community. American Muslims are also as likely as others to be college educated, and compared to other groups, American Muslims are more likely to be students, less likely to be retired. So again, a very young community. American Muslims are job creators. As a result of, this is a very vibrant, contributing community. And I'll tell you some of the details of what that looks like later on. American Muslims are on par with other faith and non-faith groups in military service, as likely to have served in the military. American Muslims across age and race remain among the most devoted to their faith. And American Muslim religious attendance, in terms of coming to a mosque like this, is consistent across years, has not gone up or down. Now, when it comes to discrimination and Islamophobia, Muslim Islamophobia index score is on the rise. Meaning what? Meaning Muslims themselves, this is one of the biggest findings of our study, are increasingly endorsing anti-Muslim stereotypes. They're increasingly internalizing those negative images of their own community. Muslims also remain the most likely to report experiencing religious discrimination, and there is a connection, I believe, between these two facts. Older Muslims are less likely to report religious discrimination. White Muslims, or Muslims who choose white on as their racial classification, are the most likely to say that they've been discriminated against for their religion. Muslims are the most likely to face institutional discrimination, and they're also the most likely to experience interpersonal discrimination, and this is, when I say discrimination, I mean religious discrimination. Unfortunately, discrimination does not only impact adults. We also found that Muslim families remain the most likely to have a child bullied for their faith. So let me now get into the details. Who are American Muslims now? As I mentioned, Muslims are America's youngest faith community. So this is the percentage of the community that is between the ages of 18 and 24. And you can see that that's a full 26% of American Muslims compared to only 8% of Jews and all single digits except for non-affiliated Americans. But that young cohort is nearly 4 times the size of other faith groups. By far the youngest faith community. A whole quarter of the community between the ages of 18 and 24, basically college students. Most Muslims remain America's most likely faith community to be poor as well. So this is people who report less than $30,000 of income a year for their household. It's 33% among American Muslims, with 22% on the other side with 100,000 or more. You can see, compared to other faith communities, it's higher than the Jewish community, the Catholic community, and even the general public. Black Muslims are more likely than white and Asian Muslims to be poor. So Muslims are among the most racially diverse faith community, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. And the socioeconomics is not homogeneous across the community. However, Muslims are as likely as most other groups to be college educated or higher. And that's an interesting seeming contradiction, most likely to be poor but just as educated as everyone else. And it does suggest that there is a large number of educated people who are not working at their level of education, and that tends to be the case among refugees. So if you think about the waves of refugees that have entered the United States over the past, say, 20 years, many of them are Muslims, starting from Afghanistan, Iraq, before that Bosnia, and then most recently Syria. Many, doctors driving Ubers in that group. American Muslims are the least likely of all other groups to be retired, not surprising. And women across most groups are less likely than men to be employed full-time. So American Muslims are not unique in this. They're very similar to American Jews, Catholics, Protestants in terms of the disparity between working full-time for men and women. And this has gotten even, and this disparity has grown through the pandemic, as I'm sure you've heard through, on the news. Nearly 1 in 10 Muslims own their own business. So this is an interesting data point because it starts to paint a picture of the contributions of American Muslims on a national scale. Muslim business owners, on average, employ 8 people for each business, and that translates into 1.37 million jobs. Now, that number, just to kind of put it into context, it's more jobs than are created by the auto industry, an industry that we all bailed out. Billions of dollars poured into that industry because of the jobs they created. And American Muslims create more jobs than the auto industry. Muslims are as likely as Catholics and Protestants to serve in the U.S. military. 11% of Muslims served in the military, very similar to Catholics and Protestants. Now, American Muslims are more likely than other groups to say religion is very important. So it's interesting to look at religiosity and compare across groups. The group that always wins out in this contest, if it is one, are white evangelicals. 83% say religion is important, very important to them, very important part of their daily life. But Muslims are just behind that, with 70% saying that their religion is a very important part of their daily life. And this has basically not changed over the past, I'd say, 10 years that I've been doing this kind of work. What I think is so interesting, though, is, and this is going to maybe surprise some Muslims in the room, young Muslims are just as likely as their elders to say that religion is important to them. They may not be showing up at the mosque, but it's not because they don't care. So there's a different reason for it. But they are just as likely as their elders to say that their faith is an important part of their daily life. And very different than their cohorts in the general public. Their generational cohorts are very different from them. So if you look here, the orange is Muslims and the light blue is general public. For 18 to 29-year-olds, the Muslims, 67% say religion is important to them, compared to in the general public, the same age group, only 30% say the same. Same with 30 to 49-year-olds, Generation X, right? 71% of Muslims say religion's important. Again, young people, young professionals, just as likely as their elders, compared to only 31% in the general public. And then 50 and over, 47% in the general public say religion's important, compared to 74 among Muslims. So I think this is a very important slide for community leaders, for anyone working within the youth space, because I think the problem sometimes gets misdiagnosed as young people just not caring about their religion, and that's not the case. Unlike their peers, they're actually very committed, but may find other obstacles to engaging with the mosque. Muslims of different racial and ethnic groups are on par in view of their religion. So American Muslims are incredibly diverse, the only faith group with no majority race. But the one thing they tend to agree on is that their faith is important to them, whether they identify as Black, white, Asian, or Arab. Now, when it comes to religious service, this number has stayed very, very, very stable. 42% of people in America who identify as Muslim say that they attend a religious service once a week or more. It's very similar to Protestants, well, Protestants are at 55%, so a little bit more than Catholics at 30%, and much lower than white evangelicals at 72%. Muslims equally likely to be unmosqued across gender and age. That's a shocker, right? We always think that only some people are unmosqued. But if you say that, if you define being unmosqued as saying that you never go to the mosque, you have not gone, even one single time except for a wedding or a funeral in the past year, the percentage among men and women, among young people and older people, is really very similar across the board for Muslims. It's not worse among one group versus another. And I think this is an important point, because when people talk about some people feeling alienated at the mosque, yeah, there are people who feel alienated across different backgrounds. It's not just one group or another. And so that means making mosques more inclusive, more open, is going to, all boats will rise, not just for one group. So now I've given you sort of a snapshot of who American Muslims are today. Now I'm going to talk about one of the biggest challenges facing the community around Islamophobia and discrimination. So Muslims remain the most likely to report experiencing religious discrimination, with 62% of Muslims compared to 52% of Jewish people and 27% of Catholics, and a similar percentage in the other categories say that they have experienced some frequency of religious-based discrimination in the last year. So the majority of both Muslims and Jews say that they have experienced some frequency of religious discrimination. And that 62% among Muslims has stayed incredibly stable. Strangely, during the Obama administration, during the Trump administration, during the Biden administration, it has not changed, 62%. And that's what I just said. Over the past 6 years, frequency of religious discrimination has been unchanged for Muslims. 2016, that was during the Obama administration, was at 60%, and it basically has not moved since then. What makes the kind of discrimination that Muslims experience, what makes it unique is that it is both on the institutional level and on the interpersonal level. So it's not just someone says something rude to you at the grocery store. There is also an institutional manifestation of Islamophobia. So for example, when applying for a job, 37% of American Muslims say that they have been discriminated against for their faith, compared to 5% of Jewish people, 6% in the general public. When interacting with law enforcement, 38%. At the airport, who's had that happen, right? Nobody at all, right? All of us. If you don't raise your hand, you've never been to an airport. 44% have experienced religious-based discrimination at the airport. 27% when receiving health care services, and 46% on social media from social media platforms, from the platform itself. Now, notice that that is the highest also for Jewish respondents, as well as the general public, that feels that they're being discriminated against for their faith by social media outlets. Now, Muslims are more likely than other groups to also experience religious discrimination in personal interactions. So 43% say that they experienced it when interacting with coworkers, compared to 29% of Jewish respondents. On social media from other users, that's where, so interpersonal, but in the digital world, that's where it's much more similar to other respondents. 56% of Muslims, 51% of Jewish respondents. Where Muslims really stand out, sadly, is nearly half of Muslim families report a child has faced religious-based bullying. 20% within that, this is, some level of frequency. 20% say within that, say it's almost every day that this is happening, which is a huge chunk. 20% of Muslim kids are being bullied every single day for their faith. Now, where is this coming from? Where is the bullying coming from? Online from other students, at school from other students, but here's the one that really kind of unsettled me. From a teacher or another school official at school. 42% of kids who are bullied by their own teacher, that it's an adult doing the bullying, not another child, including online, a teacher or a school official online, 19%. That's an incredibly high number. And that really points to the fact that training is necessary for teachers on not only how to stop bullying in their classroom, but how to not be a bully themselves. Now, that's kind of the backdrop of the impact of Islamophobia. Now we're going to kind of dig into the Islamophobia index. So we created an index, a way of measuring a phenomena in society a few years ago called the Islamophobia index. And the way the index works is it's made up of 5 statements where people are asked to rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 means strongly disagree and 5 means strongly agree. And these 5 statements are 5 tropes that when people endorse them, it is linked with agreement with discriminatory policies. So the reason we chose these is because other research that we're building on found that endorsing these points of view is linked to consenting to discriminatory, undemocratic policies targeting Muslims. And it's important that I explain this because you can test a bunch of different sentiments. Some will be neutral. Like most Muslims are Arab. That's kind of a stereotype that's just simply inaccurate. That doesn't link to agreement with bad policy. So it's an inaccurate statement, but it's not as harmful as saying most Muslims living in the United States are more prone to violence than others, discriminate against women, are hostile to the United States, are less civilized than other people, and are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by other Muslims. These 5 key sentiments are the most harmful in terms of what they link to in the policy sphere. So we've done quite a bit of research on the Islamophobia index and why it's something we should be watching. So we found that Islamophobia is bad for democracy and security for everyone, not just Muslims. Why? Because a higher Islamophobia index score in the public is linked to a greater acceptance of military targeting of civilians. So more of a condoning of violence, the exact thing that the Islamophobia index is actually accusing Muslims of. A greater acceptance of individual targeting of civilians. A greater acceptance of authoritarian attitudes and greater support for discriminatory policies such as the Muslim ban and surveillance of mosques. So the Islamophobia index is important because it predicts or is linked to agreement with endorsing violence, accepting authoritarianism, and accepting discriminatory policies toward Muslims. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that Islamophobia opens the door for many other types of bigotry. For example, anti-Semitism. The variable most strongly linked to self-reported prejudice toward Muslims is self-reported prejudice toward Jews. So respondents who said that they feel a great deal of prejudice toward Jews were 32 times as likely to report feeling a great deal of prejudice toward Muslims. This is their own reported level of prejudice. It's not something we're telling them they feel. They're saying, I feel this level of prejudice toward Muslims and Jews. Why that's so important is that 32 times as likely was the single strongest variable in that study. It was an even stronger predictor of anti-Muslim prejudice, even stronger than a negative view of Islam as a faith. How someone viewed the Jewish community was a stronger predictor of Islamophobia than how they viewed Islam as a faith. Now, what predicts lower Islamophobia? Being a Democrat, that's just what the data says. Don't get mad at me. Favorable views of Black Americans, favorable views of Muslims, that's not surprising, favorable views of Jews, favorable views of the LGBTQ community, and knows something about Islam. Moderate predictors, favorable views of feminism, knows a Muslim, and having higher income, which is linked to higher education. Weak predictors, identifying as liberal, unfavorable views of evangelicals, and has a close Muslim friend. And those are weak predictors, not as strong as the strong predictors. Now, factors that do not predict Islamophobia at all, okay? Nativity, meaning were you born in the US or were you not born in the US? That does not matter. Sex, women and men are equally likely, all other factors being equal, to be Islamophobic or not Islamophobic. Age, that's the shocker, right? Being young or being old didn't end up being a factor. Level of education, and very, very importantly, religiosity. Religiosity is not a predictor of Islamophobia. This is not actually a religious issue. It is much more an issue of political ideology. So why should we care about Islamophobia if we don't happen to be a Muslim? Because according to neuroscience, fear makes us more accepting of authoritarianism, conformity, and prejudice. Fear kills freedom. If we care about our own freedom, then we have to be concerned about rising Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in our country. So where are we today on the Islamophobia index? Now, what we've done is we've standardized the scale where it goes from 0 to 100. 0 means everyone picked strongly disagree on every single one of those questions, and 100 means everyone picked 5 strongly agree on every one of those questions. And the numbers are in between 17 and 30. So the lowest group on the Islamophobia index this year was the Jewish community at 17. That's the index score. 22 for the non-affiliated community, 23 for Protestants, 25 for the general public, 26 for Muslims. This is the big surprise of the entire study. Catholics at 28 and white evangelicals at 30. So what is going on with these numbers? So if you look across time, Muslims more likely to endorse anti-Muslim tropes since 2016, while other groups are actually in decline in Islamophobia. So in 2018, white evangelicals were the highest at 40. 40 is the highest Islamophobia index we've ever measured. And that was in the height of the sort of Trump administration at 2018. They have since come down and are at 30 right now. And if you look at every other line, it's mostly stable or in decline. The only number that is sort of steadily climbing since 2019 has been Muslims. And Islamophobia is not uniform across Muslim communities. So different Muslim communities have different points of view. Islamophobia rises sharply among Muslims who identify as white. Their Islamophobia index is 40, on par with what white evangelicals were at in 2018. Non-white Muslims are in the 14, 15, kind of where you would expect a Muslim to be. Islamophobia remains stable among white and Hispanic Americans in the general public, however. And now, when you look at each question in the Islamophobia industry, 1/4 of Muslims agree with the trope that Muslims are prone to violence. Now, this is a really important thing to kind of talk about, because this was picked up by the Islamophobia industry when the poll came out. And they said, look, even Muslims agree. It's not us, it's them saying that they're violent. Well, first of all, it's not all Muslims who say that, or even close. But when you look at who has had this idea sort of pounded into them from the Muslim community, it's young people more than anyone. Most Muslims and Jews, however, reject the notion that Muslims discriminate against women. Muslims are as likely as Catholics to agree that Muslims are hostile to the United States, and nearly 1 in 5 Muslims agree with the trope that Muslims are less civilized. And finally, Muslims are the most likely to agree, this is key, that Muslims are partially responsible for acts of violence carried out by others. This is the idea of collective blame or collective guilt. When people start to internalize the idea that they are somehow responsible for the acts of someone else they don't know, they've never met, have absolutely nothing to do with, because they share part of their identity, it means that they have fully internalized the collective guilt that has been, imposed on them for basically the past 20 years. So, making sense of internalized Islamophobia, one scholar, Dr. Muniba Salim, put it this way: there are well-documented studies showing that minorities can internalize the negative stereotypes of their group, and that can influence their self-esteem, psychological distress, motivation, and performance. Other research has examined the negative consequences of media stereotypes on minorities' self-esteem and experience of shame and embarrassment, as well as concerns of how the majority group will view them. It's worth noting that internalized Islamophobia is more prevalent among younger Muslims and older members of the community. Americans who have lived the majority of their lives after 9/11, 2001, in a country that has demonized their identity in popular culture, news media, political rhetoric, and in policy circles. Research suggests that this kind of steady drumbeat of bigoted ideas and state actions have a detrimental impact on the target group's self-image and mental health. Another noteworthy and alarming finding was the disproportionately negative views among white Muslims, who are also the most likely to report experiencing regular religious discrimination. Some studies on internalized racism have surprisingly found that endorsing negative stereotypes about one's own group is associated with a higher sense of control. So when children blame themselves for being abused, they actually do so to cope with the abuse because it gives them a sense of control. So what are the recommendations? What should we do? I'll start with Muslim community leaders. Recognize internalized Islamophobia as a major challenge facing young Muslims and integrate accurate information about the community into educational content. Muslims are consuming the exact same media as everybody else. The difference, though, is that they pay more attention. It is much more salient for them than it is for the general public. When you see that Muslim character, when you see that story about Muslims, you pay attention a lot more than someone else who isn't Muslim. So it's impacting Muslims even more than it is other people. So the need for accurate information, don't think that this is, any of this information is, who Muslims are, what they believe, what are the facts, that this is something that every Muslim knows. Absolutely not. This is something that is important for Muslims themselves to understand, so that the negative information is being counteracted with positive information about who Muslims are and how they contribute. Address Muslim mental health challenges with greater awareness and resource allocation. Educate community members to report institutional Islamophobia and bullying to relevant authorities. Promote and facilitate careers in media and mental health to young people, badly needed. And engage in intra-Muslim conversations about race and racial healing. Interfaith leaders and allies. What are some recommendations for all you wonderful people who are here? Seek to partner with Muslim organizations and leaders on issues of collective importance, things like climate change and public health. Think of the Muslim community as a part of, just like any other community who's interested and concerned and has a stake in what is important to everyone. Include anti-Islamophobia content in your inclusion and diversity training, policies, and hiring practices. Familiarize your networks with the manifestation and roots of Islamophobia and the Islamophobia industry. Recognize Islamophobia as both individual and institutional. Social media companies. If there's anyone here from social media companies, I'm going to share with you, or anyone online. Engage Muslim communities in a review of platform community norms and the application of policies toward Muslim users. Review anti-bullying safeguards from a religious discrimination-informed lens. Oftentimes, religion is not incorporated when people think about online discrimination. Consider applying misinformation warnings to anti-Muslim conspiracy theories and false claims. It's so interesting now. I'll see like a post on Instagram, and it's saying, corporations have made this much money out of the inflation that we've all been enduring for the past 2.5 years. And there will be a misinformation warning under that post. This isn't like coronavirus. This is like, oh my God, we're saying bad things about corporations. What's the danger, really? I mean, what are we all going to do to them? But yet, when there's a piece of flagrant misinformation being propagated about a very vulnerable religious minority, it's like, freedom of speech. It's very interesting what we put, what warnings, what is the misinformation warning put on and what it isn't. Include anti-Islamophobia content in your inclusion and diversity training, policies, and hiring practices. And educators, and this is so important, teachers, administrators, principals, include anti-Islamophobia content in your inclusion and diversity training of staff and administrators. Teach about the contributions of diverse communities, especially those of the children in your classroom. And we have tons of resources on our website if you need them. Discuss bullying in your classroom and what it sounds like and how bystanders can stand up to bullies, including online. Explore your own unintended bias and educate yourself about the children under your care, and provide a concrete way to address bullying by adults. Media professionals, the journalists, the editors, the producers, equip your newsroom, equip your writer's room or your newsroom with resources to portray Muslim communities accurately and creatively, keeping in mind the impact of trope-perpetrating media on Muslims themselves and their self-concept, as well as the public acceptance of prejudice and anti-democratic policies. Recruit and hire more Muslim journalists, editors, writers, and producers. Explore your own unintended bias and educate yourself about the communities on which you tell stories. And include anti-Islamophobia content in your newsroom and staff inclusion and diversity training and initiatives. So to learn more, please visit ispu.org, where you can sign up for our mailing list and get cutting-edge research right in your inbox every single month. And you can read the entire study that I just went through. There's much more that I didn't cover, a lot more, at ispu.org/poll. Follow us on social media to keep up with our research, ISPU on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
So at this point, we are going to take a short pause to allow some time for our Muslim attendees to offer their prayers. And while that is happening, those of us remaining in the room will take a few minutes for conversation. So we invite you to turn to your neighbors and gather in groups of 3 or 4 people and have a chat about these 2 questions. What surprised you about the data you've just heard? What have you learned about American Muslims? Based on what you have heard, how can you be a truth ambassador or an agent of change in your community? So we are also distributing cards that you can use to write down your questions. You can hand them to an ICJS staff member, and Dalia Mogahed will answer as many as she can during the Q&A portion in a few minutes. So please start gathering in your groups, and we'll let you know when we are ready to start the next part of our program. Thank you. So we are ready now for the Q&A portion. If you could all take your seats. We will be beginning the next portion in 2 minutes. Thank you. So we are now ready. We have the questions. Please take your seats, and Dalia Mogahed will answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for coming back and sticking with us. We're going to answer a few questions before you all can continue your conversation and have some refreshments in the back. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start with some questions. In terms of children being bullied for being Muslim, I'm wondering if it was authentically for their Muslim faith, or could it have been more bias of their culture in general? Is it faith specifically being targeted or looking different, having different traditions in general? An important clarification perhaps. So that's a really good question. I actually can't answer that definitively. Why? Because we're asking respondents to tell us a self-reported experience. And the respondent believes it's because of their faith that their child was being bullied. So discrimination and bullying is very complicated. You could call someone a name that is a stereotype of being a Muslim, but it's also a stereotype of being, from a specific country. So it's hard to tell, but the experience of the family is that they believe it is because of their faith tradition. It's very hard to parse out what exactly is driving the bullying. Could you say a bit about bias, again, bullying, particularly in the institutional setting regarding gender? Are these, I'm sorry, the light is my eyes and the handwriting, so please forgive me. Are these slurs considered in the are these slurs or are these differences of sex considered in the breadth of the data? So we don't ask parents, if their children are boys or girls. So we don't actually know if the bullying is impacting girls more than boys. We do know that as adults, Muslim women do report experiencing religious discrimination more often than men. So if that's any indication, it might be the case for girls more than boys. We actually just don't know that. But Islamophobia is gendered, where women are more likely than men to report discrimination, and young people are more likely than older people to report discrimination, and people of lower socioeconomic status are also more likely to report religious Islamophobic discrimination. So it tends to target the most vulnerable within the most vulnerable community, basically. Has Islamophobia dramatically increased as a result of 9/11? Okay, great question. And you always have to pick which slides you show because I can't show all the slides. But I do have a slide that you can find on our website that shows a time trend on a question that Pew, not ISPew, but that Pew asked starting November 2001. And that question is, it asks people to report their degree of agreement to the sentiment that Islam encourages violence more than other religions, which is a really good Islamophobic trope. So the percentage of Republicans in November of 2001 who said that they believed Islam encourages violence more than other faiths was 33%, 2001, 2 months after 9/11. Fast forward to 2017. Anyone want to guess the percentage of Republicans who believe that Islam encourages violence more than other religions in 2017? What was your 66%. Very good. Yes, that is it. That is the number. So what you actually find when you look at the data is that 9/11 did not trigger Islamophobia. What did trigger it are two things. The run-up to the Iraq War, where that number kept climbing steadily, and it spiked during the 2008 and 2012, and of course the 2016 election season. And it's at its all-time high since 2016. So interestingly, one question that Pew had asked before 9/11 and right after was favorability of American Muslims. And in that same study in November of 2001, the percentage of Americans who said they had favorable opinions of American Muslims actually increased, got better than it was right before 9/11. So what explains all of the things I just said? Leadership explains it. The way that leaders speak to people is what explains Islamophobia, not what happens on the ground, not bad Muslims doing bad things. When leaders speak in a way that is harmonizing, like actually did happen right after 9/11 with George W. Bush, that is reflected in public sentiment. When leaders are divisive, like around election seasons and in the run-up to war, that is reflected in public sentiment. So I think it's very important to know these things because you can then be very critical of the fact that you can be critical consumers of information so that you don't allow us all as citizens of our country to be manipulated and for Islamophobia to be used as a tool of public manipulation. Okay? With many American Muslims being first and second generation in an American Islam, with many American Muslims being first and second generation, is an American Islam emerging in the way we can now speak of an American Judaism? That's a very interesting question. I think many Muslims would be uncomfortable with the idea of an American Islam. Now, some people have talked about it, but I'm just saying, from my experience, that would be an uncomfortable way to describe how Islam is practiced in America. I think American Muslims strive to be authentically Muslim and not to, Americanize their Islam. However, every single Muslim community in the world practices their faith according to, colored with their culture. There is no way to avoid it. I'm Egyptian, and I know how Egyptians practice. It's different slightly in different ways than how Indonesians practice. It's different from how sub-Saharan African, Senegalese people practice. Some things are very common, and some things are uniquely part of that community. And there's nothing wrong with American Muslims to have their own uniqueness. But in terms of Islamic, authenticity and correctness of practice, American Muslims are very careful to not allow that in most cases. And I find it interesting, and I'll tell you something I think is really interesting. People who have left, a country of origin 40 years ago and have come to the United States and have built Islamic institutions and so forth, will go back to their country of origin and feel like so much has changed in the way people behave and how they practice their faith. And yet they have frozen in time, the Pakistan of 40 years ago. So if anything, American Muslims tend to be kind of more likely to hold on to tradition in terms of the way Islam is practiced. The other thing that I think is interesting about the way, sort of the mainstream American Muslim community practices their faith is because it tends to be such a diverse community, people try to kind of go back to the original text in many cases, rather than assuming that their cultural practice is the only way to do it. So I think it's a really interesting, almost social experiment to be in a place where where it's like the second Mecca, right? Because the entire world is represented in the United States, and everyone's bringing their thoughts and ideas, whether they've been in the United States and their ancestors have been here for 500 years, or they just arrived as refugees, and all of this is being mixed in one space. And they're negotiating those things. And when you negotiate so many diverse ideas, what people tend to do is have to go to the common denominator just to get along. And the common denominator tends to be the core of the faith. And so is there an American Islam? I think some people might even think that might even say that American Islam, if there is such a thing, is more, I'll use the word puritanical, but I don't mean it in a negative sense. I mean more kind of striking into the core and the fundamentals of the faith, rather than focusing on tangentials or cultural practices, just as a matter of necessity, so that you're going to the central concepts that everybody agrees on. What is the reason for the large percentage of young Muslims in the U.S.? Okay. Is it the age of the immigrant population, the growing size of Muslim families, or something else? So that is a really good question. Why are Muslims so much younger? I think there's a number of factors. So one is half of Muslims were born outside the United States and half were born in the United States. So there is a large immigrant component, and immigrants do tend to be younger people that are going to have the craziness to, move from one country to another. They're going to be younger generally. So that's one major factor is the fact that half of Muslims are immigrants. Another factor is Muslim families are slightly larger than the average American family. It's not by a lot, but that is a factor. So if you have younger immigrants and you have people who are having, if they're younger, they're going to be having children more often than people who are older. And so you do have a younger populations produce more younger populations, if that makes sense. I think the final thing, though, could be Well, yes, exactly. So with half of Muslims being immigrants from all over the world, not just one area, immigrants do tend to be younger. So I think that that's the major reason, and then younger people have children more often than older people. I guess I'll just stop it. Those are probably the two variables that explain the young population. Okay, so one more. To what do you attribute the strong devotion and affiliation among young Muslims in comparison with their counterparts in other faith traditions? So that's an interesting question. What do I attribute it to? I guess it's probably the same thing I attribute, it's very similar, I think, to the idea that young Muslims, Muslims in general, when you compare it to the general public, are more devoted to their faith than the average person, not the average religious person in say, like a white evangelical context, but when compared to the general public. So we're comparing Muslim young people to young people in the general public, not young people in the white evangelical community. So let's be clear about that. So I think just in general, Muslims are more devoted to their faith, and so that will also spill over to young people. But why do young Muslims tend to be more devoted, or as devoted as their elders, which doesn't tend to be the case in other faith communities in terms of comparisons? I think part of it is that their identity has been, it's kind of the reason, ironically, that young Muslims are more likely to internalize anti-Muslim sentiment. When your identity is so under threat and so targeted and so demonized and so politicized, you kind of do one of two things. You own it even stronger, or you want to disown it completely. And so a small minority have decided to join the enemy, kind of in their view, and say, yeah, I'm agreeing with you that we have a problem, or Muslims are bad. But the majority are going the other direction and are actually digging in and owning it, and actually asking the question, what is this faith that I'm being so targeted for? I think it makes faith relevant. Whether it's negative or positive, it makes it relevant. You can't just ignore it. You can't be a young person. It's very easy to be a young person who happens to be a Protestant and not think about your faith for 1 second in your day, because it's not being targeted. It's not being pointed out. You're not having to be defending it every second. So it cannot be important to you because it's not being it's not relevant. It's not something that you have to be talking about every day. But when you're a young Muslim, your faith is something, whether you like it or not, that you are aware of every second of your life. You're walking around very aware of the fact that you're Muslim. And so when you are aware, it will many times translate to being much more relevant in your life as a consequence of that. At least that's my guess. And that's it. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank again Dalia Mogahed both for her illuminating lecture tonight and more broadly for her important work she's doing in building interreligious bridges by compiling accurate data about the American Muslim community, work that is vital to have meaningful dialogue that is informed by reliable and representative facts. ICJS has recorded this Mannequin Clark lecture, and we will send you all a link to everyone who registered for tonight's event once it's posted on YouTube. You will also be receiving an email with a link for a survey about tonight's program. These surveys give us valuable feedback and help us to continually improve our programs. So we ask that you take the time to fill it out, please. We invite you to check out some of our upcoming events, including a class I will be teaching next month on Allah, same as the biblical God or totally other, and an online program with my dear colleague Matt Taylor on God on the Ballot, a discussion on Christian nationalism on the eve of the election. For more information and to register for these events and to sign up for our monthly ICJS Insights newsletter, please visit our website, icjs.org. Finally, all of our ICJS programs are free to the public, made possible by the generosity and vision of our donors. We hope you will consider joining us as a supporter by donating online at our website. If you look behind you, you'll see some round tables and chairs. We invite you to stay a bit, have a cup of tea, enjoy some cookies, and continue the conversation. Thank you, and have a good night.